This is Designing the Revolution. You're listening to Chapter 18, Part 2, A22. So, in the previous chapter, we were looking in some detail about how these A22 civil resistance organisations are set up, and how they're structured, and how they're really a manifestation of the work that we've been doing over the last 10 or 12 episodes in terms of creating proximity, sociability, design, organisation, and what have you. So what I'm going to do in this final part on the A22 network is look at the broader picture and the international aspects of this. Because as we identified at the beginning of the last episode, the big strategic picture here is this transformation global by definition. Otherwise, it's going to be no transformation at all, because what's obvious, of course, is the climate crisis is global, the economic crisis is global, there's a big internet connected world. And the good news, because obviously a lot of people feel this is, makes everything radical a bit useless. But the good news is we're in this massively connected world, and it's extremely easy via Zoom, for instance, for lots of different people to connect over big distances. So the real question is, how do you organise people from different countries in some sort of single organisational space? And again, as we've discussed, there's these two extremes, these two juxtapositions that get sort of trolleyed out every time you're thinking about organisational issues. So you have the old, Leninist routine, not necessarily called Leninist, but, top down, old, pre-1989, whole load of blokes usually, hogging power, self-selecting, dysfunctional, semi-corrupt, reformist at best, and everyone else oppressed by them, inverted commas. And at the other extreme, you have this horizontalist, self-indulgent, chaotic, ever flowing, ebbing and flowing mess of a sort of horizontalist orientation, which is great for, setting things up and initial enthusiasm, but very rapidly creates disillusionment, dysfunctionality, hidden hierarchies, abuses of power because there's no accountability and such like. So what we're going to do when we're looking at international governance, let's call it that, is try and apply these principles we've already been developing and say, this is no big deal, right? And there's, the Earth's a big place, but it's got its limits, and we just need to design with the same sensitivity and analytical vigour, as you might say, that we do, a small organisation in Manchester in the UK. Why not? So here's a design, right? So in the A22 network, quite early on, what we made this decision was we were moving on. Again, we're moving on from this horizontalist, we're all meeting together without any structure, this sort of fluffy networking idea, to an organisational structure. So this is the big move. The A22 is an organisation. It's called the A22 Network because people just use the word network, but formally speaking, it's an organisation. It's not people just coming together and drifting around. It's like, you're in. If you're in, you're in. If you're out, you're out. There's a clear dividing line. There's a membership. And if you're a member, then you get to have one person sitting on the international team. And that team meets once a month, and it has a constitution. So you know how to get in. If you're an A22 group, you know how you get formally become a member of A22. You're voted in the last analysis. It's a majority vote. If you all turn into, fascists or, psychopaths or whatever, there's a way to get rid of you. In other words, this is an ordered organisation. It's written down. There's not pages on it. There's 2 or 3 pages on the Constitution. How you get in, how you asked to leave. These are always 2 critical questions. Does this central group, they have an agenda, they discuss some matters, there's a number of working groups about particular topics. Those working groups report to the executive, this group, they have the final say. So it should all sound reasonably familiar as this A22 orientation. And then what's a little bit different, I suppose, is what's called the International Mobilisation Group, which is a bit of a mouthful, but that's really, without beating around the bush, the bureaucracy. They're the group that goes to meet with other new groups, monitor existing groups, facilitate various training events and what have you. So you notice there's a professionalisation of what you might call the civil service element. So again, this is a bit transgressive of horizontalist dogma, as it were, where, everyone just gets together. No, if you want everyone to get together, someone has to do the work. If you want someone to do the work, ideally, they need to be paid to do it reasonably, or at least to focus on it in terms of full time. And what that does is it creates a solid, coherent centre. So it's not like just making decisions and then, 2 months later it hasn't been implemented because no one's had the time. It's more like, no, there's a bunch of people, 3 or 4 people. It's nothing dramatic at this stage of the game. And they have defined powers. They have to do a report. There's protocols. Again, we're not talking about 100 pages or anything. But there's a clear, fundamental paradigmic moving on from this sort of networking, voluntaristic orientation. And that doesn't prevent, and arguably it actually encourages a voluntaristic ethic in the sense that they can help people organise Zooms, connections, one-to-ones between the different groups. So, that's the top line stuff. In a minute, I'm going to look into a few more detailed elements of it. But, the words that come to mind are, it's defined, okay? It's a defined organisation. It's clear. And, of course, it's good enough. No one's pretending that this isn't going to have major conflicts or whatever, but, the proposition is it doesn't have unnecessary conflicts. It's doing a good job. And there's this concept we're going to talk about a little bit more in 5 minutes or so, which is there's a balance, right? There's a balance between the bureaucracy and the actual members of the different organisations, the different membership organisations, and then there's a balance between the autonomy of those organisations and the centre as a balance. All right, so let's look into this in a little bit more detail for 5-6 minutes. A central critique of the horizontalist orientation is that it creates unordered conflict. In other words, you have 2 conflicts going on at the same time. You have the conflict, should animal rights organisations, be involved in A22? It's a substantive conflict, and there's always going to be those conflicts, But then there's the unordered conflict, or there's the unnecessary conflict, which is how do we decide whether direct action organisations from the animal rights movement are involved in A22? Well, and the classic question is, who decides, and then who decides. We've discussed this a few times. This is not just a peripheral problem. This brings down networks, as I'm sure some of you know. It's because there's a confusion over power. There's a confusion over who's got power and who hasn't got power. And of course, the reason why there's a confusion over power is because there's this, rather entitled bourgeois romanticism that you can get rid of power by pretending there is no power, which is utter nonsense, of course. So what happens is the power re-emerges in a more toxic form because you can't decide, you're in denial about power. So people that do take power can cover for themselves. They can pretend they don't have power even though they do. And a whole bunch of sort of toxic rabbit holes that tends to happen. So the nice thing about this is, in a single stroke, you can say, no, those problems, 9 times out of 10 aren't going to occur because we don't need to have process conflict, as you might say. We don't need to have unordered conflict. We're always going to have conflict. Human beings want different things. But the conflict is ordered, which is the constitutional proposition, which, of course, again, can go to an extreme. You can have, massively complex constitutions which send everyone to sleep. But hopefully you can see, again, this is a sort of balanced orientation. And this ordered conflict is supported by the Constitution, right? It's like these are the branches of the tree, but every tree doesn't just have branches; it has leaves. In other words, you need the structure, the hard constitutional power arrangements, but then upon that you're building this culture of sociability. This is the oil that oils the wheels, to use another analogy. And we've talked about a whole bunch of ways in which this is facilitated, check-ins, people socialising together, having weekends away, respect for individual difference, respect for the person, and such like. So a particular sort of micro routine here, which I don't think I've emphasised this, but tends to come into play quite a lot, where you have sort of higher political institutions, as you might call them, is there are genuine balancing conflicts, and they can become quite tortuous. So one of the routines here, which we have had in a number of organisations I've worked with, which have followed this orientation, is you talk about something for 15 minutes. If after 15 minutes there's not an emergent consensus, then the protagonists, the two people or the two groups that have got the biggest problem, go away, and they're forced to work together to work out something which all the group is going to agree on. And 8 times out of 10, the other people in the group are broadly okay, as long as those two groups are happy with it. So what this does is it prevents this, this problem you have on both on the Leninist extreme and horizontalist extreme, is this 8-hour meeting rubbish, which, for anyone that's vaguely normal is death-inducing. In other words, all your meetings shouldn't be more than 2 hours long. Occasionally it might be 4 hours because you're having a big review and you have a break in the middle, but they're human. And they have this 15-minute rule. In other words, like, you don't get into this big clashy sort of conflict, which is always undermining of trust and what have you. It's like, let's take a breather. You guys can talk about it. You can talk about it in a more informal context. You're not playing to the audience. You're not trying to get shamed or and what have you, because you're shown to lose in front of other people. You can have a more private chat, discuss it in a more informal setting, and 9 times out of 10, people are going to sort it out. We've already discussed this notion of a bureaucracy, so I'm going to pass over that a little bit. But just to emphasise, this is a major cultural change. People being paid to do these background jobs. Again, this de-stresses the whole system, and assuming they're doing the job well, it just makes it a lot more joyful to work in the organisation, as a representative, because you've got this support by people who will provide the minutes and write stuff up and keep policies and what have you. Then there's the induction. So we're all familiar now with this induction process. People who become representatives, they don't suddenly march into the constitutional group, with no briefing, no induction, how it works. They've got 2 or 3 hours on it. Again, you don't have to spend hours and days on it. And that the function of the induction is to create the sophistication of cooperative working. If someone disagrees with you, don't panic about it. There is an ordered constitution to support you. You don't have to go into life and death mode, which is often what you find in structuralist settings, because people don't feel protected, they don't feel supported. The beauty of a constitution is that there's a way of deciding, and if you don't get your way, then it's clear. You don't need to get bitter and twisted about it. It's just the way it is. It's what's called democracy, for instance. Yeah, so that helps. And then that connects with the next point, which is what I would call like an ecology of community. Okay, so you've got the hard structure, as I said, the tree, the branches, and then on top of that layer, you've got this infrastructure of a culture that creates this cooperative atmosphere. So, for instance, you have training events. Maybe you have training events on working groups, what the function of a constitution is. Lots of people don't know this. I'm a nerdy person. Maybe a few of you are. You understand what a constitution. Most people, no idea. They don't even know why it's important. So you have trainings on it, which encourages greater understanding. You have inspirational speakers. So, Noam Chomsky turns up, all these people, these international people, A22, it's got a lot of credibility. Lots of cultural figures around the world will go, yeah, you're cool, I'll come and talk to you. And you get 1,000 people on the call, and it's impressive, okay? And, a lot of these people have got a lot of very sensible things to say. So that brings people together. Again, it creates this sort of culture of connectedness. Then you have like mentoring. So the new groups, as we've discussed, they're helped. There's help on hand, if they're not getting on well, someone can facilitate a meeting and such like. And then lastly, you've got this horizontal support orientation. So again, we're not against the word horizontal in so much as there's nothing intrinsically bad about horizontal connectivity. Obviously, it's part of all ecological systems. Someone in France knows someone in Germany. They have a chat. Fantastic. This doesn't need to go through the centre. So if Germany wants to have a chat with France about, raising money through social media adverts, they don't have to ask permission. They just go and do it. It's nothing dramatic. Sometimes they might want to coordinate with other countries and have a bigger group. But at the end of the day, the whole idea is this is a mutual aid network. So we're not throwing all that baby out with the bathwater. Mutual aid is a fantastic notion. People helping each other, in order to become more effective about what they do. And then the last section on this is which is a little bit controversial. So I'm not saying this is the last word on the matter, but someone introduced me to this concept a while ago, which is the concept of the source. And there's an idea here, I can't remember whether I mentioned it in previous episodes, but I think it's quite good in terms of international organisation, which is once someone's been, someone, moves through the ranks, as it were, and they end up sitting on the international group for a year, let's say, at some point it's good for them to move out of that and allow a younger or more inexperienced person to become the representative. But they don't just disappear, or they don't fight to get back on it. The gracious thing to do, as you might say, is they become a source person. In other words, this is this elder phrase. Well, they might not actually be that old, or maybe they are. But the notion is number one, they've got gravitas, right? They prove themselves. They've gone through, maybe they've been to prison, maybe they've been arrested lots of times, they've done lots of work, maybe they've set up civil resistance organisations. So basically they're on hand, and they're brought into the central international core group, and they're asked their advice, and they give their advice. And again, 9 times out of 10, it's useful advice because they've got lots of experience. And then classically speaking, sometimes there's one person, or maybe there's 2 or 3 people who initially set it up. And it's best that those people don't fall into this sort of founder's trap of holding on to power. It's just a really boring, bollocksy thing, right? It's like, so, without beating around the bush, I'm one of the source people. Arguably, I am the source person. Who cares? It doesn't really matter. But I don't have any formal power in A22. I'm an advisor. I do lots of networking. I do videos like this. But it's not like I'm head honcho, and if I don't like the Spanish group, I can have just have an edict and get rid of them. So again, this is like a more sophisticated, holistic, you might call it indigenous-esque notion of a power formation. You know, if you look at the anthropology of in African tribes, for instance, they have older people, you know, blokes who are, you know, officially in power. But you look a little bit closer at the ecology of connections and you realize actually the only reason they have power is because they're saying something sensible. They can't really force people. So this is what you might call, you know, a pre-vicious, you know, violent extractive hierarchy sort of way of organizing society. And this is something which we're going to discuss at greater length in terms of what the political space needs to move back towards with this new philosophy of connection. All right, so, you know, there's a bunch of other bits and pieces, you might say, but hopefully it's given you a flavour. And as I said in the last talk, you know, if you're specifically interested in A22 and, you know, this is a living live moment, this isn't some academic, you know, case study of something in 1850, this is going on today, right? You can get in touch and you can get involved and you can study it and, you know, and this whole thing is likely to evolve. So what I want to do before, you know, making a few speculative final comments is to give you two quick case studies of fantastic organisational experiments in the 20th century. I'm not going to go into great detail because, again, if you're interested, you can go and look it up on the internet. You know, there's a whole bunch of books about these things, but it just gives you a taster. So what I've described to you hasn't just come out of my head or hasn't just landed out of nowhere. You know, there's a long tradition of what you might call humanistic cooperative organisation, and you know, all these things, because they've actually existed in history, have got their pros and cons. No one's pretending they're perfect. But they're enormously inspiring because they provide key elements of what the post-capitalist, post-hierarchical, extractive, you know, bollocksy system we've got, where we can actually replace it with something that's just as grounded, right? This is not this isn't a utopian scenario. There's a history of organisations that have substantially managed to humanise human interaction. All right, so the first one is Mondragon. So if you haven't heard of Mondragon, you should have. Mondragon is the biggest cooperative complex, as far as I'm aware, in the world, or at least in the Western world. By cooperative complex, I mean it's a combination of banks, workers' cooperatives, you know, business cooperatives where all the workers in a business own the business, housing cooperatives where the tenants own the houses, training institutes. Started in the 1950s, and I think it started with a workers' cooperative and then it built on from there. No, actually, I think there was some sort of training institute, and it grew out of a central concept. So if you've heard me talk about balance and you think, oh yeah, balance, you know, that's quite an interesting little idea. No, balance, the concept of balance is probably the central concept of organisational design. And interestingly, it's juxtaposed, of course, to this notion of progress. The notion of progress is you're moving forward, everything's improving, you know, it's going to get better and better. Once it's really better, it's going to get improved again. The concept of balance is quite metaphysically different. It's more like the system never changes. It's either just out of balance or it's in balance. And the idea is you get it in balance. And then once it's in balance, that's it. It doesn't get super in balance. So it just oscillates. Systems just oscillate around some notion of health, and the notion of health is primarily about balance. So concretely what this means, you know, it's just not just a vague philosophical idea. It means that when you're in a group, the central question is what balance between two arguments is correct? What balance between two logics is correct? It's not saying one logic is wrong. As we've discussed previously, a logic often is right. The problem with a logic is not that it's wrong, but it's incomplete. In other words, there's another logic which covers another part of reality, and it just so happens you have to deal with both. So then you're looking at a suboptimal solution, but it's balanced. It's the least worst scenario, if you see what I mean, because it doesn't perfect either logics, but overall it's better than just going with one logic. So this is a practical, meta point when you're in a group, at 8 o'clock at night and you're feeling a bit tired and you just get into a bit of a, this is right because of these reasons, this is right because of these reasons. It's like, yeah, they're both right. How can we combine them? And so that's like, again, it significantly reduces conflict. It absolutely does not and never will remove conflict, but it keeps conflict within these bounds of a common meta understanding of what you're trying to do. Okay, the other thing which is sort of interested in with this model, and I do encourage you to read something that's really interesting if you're sort of quite nerdy about all this stuff, is I think this is significant that the Mondragon experiment came out of the Spanish Civil War and the early 50s. So these people, they had a hard time, to put it mildly, right? There's nothing at all glamorous about the Spanish Civil War and the thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that died. So they had a gravitas, this mid-20th century gravitas, which made them serious about their political philosophy, which obviously has been massively missing over the last 30 years because times have been good, and I've got no problem with good times. But one of the bad things about good times, as we've discussed, is people become slack. They become lazy. They don't care about each other in an intense and mature way, and all the rest of it. So I think what's interesting about Mondragon is, as the world wakes up to the utter horror of the climate crisis, you're going to have this maturing process, sort of not dissimilar to what happened in the Spanish Civil War or in the Second World War, right? So you're going to have increasingly people coming in to A22 spaces or into these spaces more generally going, I'm serious about this. I'm not going to mess around. This isn't just some little 6-month experiment. This is my life, right? We've got a massive job to do. So it's worth looking at how the Mondragon model translated this core culture of seriousness into this amazing, massive complex. I think it had several 100,000 people, involved in it at the peak. And the last thing is coming back to this source idea, interestingly enough, is that this the person that started it, didn't have this American, Elon Musk routine where I set this up, I'm the genius, I'm the top dog, you do what I say, I'm brutal and all this bollocks. It was like this guy was a Catholic priest, and he was embedded in the personalism of Catholic theology and political thought, which is something, I've talked about off and on during these episodes, which has been quite a big influence on me. And this notion of, at its best, and you can criticize these things, obviously, but at its best, what this personalism was saying is the human person needs to obviously be involved in the economy, but they don't need to be treated like shit. They need to be treated with respect. They need to be given time, to learn jobs. They don't need to be worked too hard. They need to be, treated with respect in conversations. They need to be given time to adapt to new working practices. All these things which are sort of common sense, except they're not, of course, in the world we live in. So this guy basically never held a formal position. He did loads of training. He was a mentor. He could have conversations with people. The founders used to come to him for advice and such like. So you have this sort of interesting non-patriarchal, non-hierarchical power, but it is a power. But it's a power which is constructive because it doesn't have a formal sort of, a formal I can get you sort of constitutional sort of situation. Okay, so the second one, to be honest with you, I'm not an expert on, so I'm just going to give a flavour of the second one, but I think it's like fascinating. And this is the experiments that happened in Chile, I think around 1972, 1974. Don't quote me on that. But as I think we've talked about this before, there was an election in Chile. The socialists got in. I think it was for the first time ever. And they started enacting a whole bunch of socialistic policies, nothing massively dramatic, but, major changes in a sort of, classical liberal framework. And most people know this because the CIA, to cut a long story short, subverted the government, and there was a coup, and the guy who led the government was shot, and Pinochet came in. So it's usually looked upon as some massive tragedy, and obviously it was in some respects. But the thing I want to focus on is something that's very, a lot less known, which was there was a sort of post-Marxist orientation with this group. They didn't want to do the old Soviet top-down sort of routine. They were trying to think in a sophisticated way about this genuine design conundrum in socialist systems, that you want to create equality, you want to create equity, you want to allocate resources in a just and efficient way. But it's actually quite difficult to know what's going on, because there's no market mechanism where arguably things, reach some equilibrium. And so what often happens is, because you've got incomplete information and you're trying to do everything through conscious human processes, you get this misallocation of resources and it becomes inefficient. And a lot of the critiques of socialism, quite rightly point to this problem. So there's a long tradition, and this has come up, a lot more with the whole digitalization situation, which is maybe with digitalization and computerization, you can get all the data and crunch all the data and get, rational resource allocation, and have through a socialistic orientation. So at this point, of course, in the early 70s, there weren't massively sophisticated computers. So this is very much a prototypical sort of situation. But the upshot of it is there's this idea of cybernetics. So you might want to check this out, which had a certain heyday in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So again, this was the science of information, how you get information from one part of a system to another. So here's what it led to. What it led to is a whole bunch of computers, and people across the economy would input information about how they were doing. And then if there was what was called an oscillation, coal production, was plummeting or something, then the people who were in charge, the civil servants and the socialist politicians, they could go, aha, there's a problem there. And they could go and attend to the oscillations that were prevalent. So if something was particularly good or particularly bad, then they would just focus on that. If things were trundling along, that would be fine. And they could, produce timelines and time series, and they could use this statistics in real time, because all this information would be coming on in real time, to create rapid responses to this system and keep it in some sort of balance. And of course, at the same time, from a political, ethical point of view, there was this accountability across the system. So, in principle, there wasn't some factories in southern Chile, running off with loads of resources, corruption and what have you, because you had this transparency. Now, what's interesting, of course, is at the time, what socialism meant, and a lot of old socialists who have this orientation, is that centralization is good, because it brings all this information together and you've got this accountability. And for them, that's what democracy means. So in the modern postmodernist period, democracy has meant everyone can do what they like in some horizontalist mess. But there's an older idea of democracy, a centralized idea of democracy, which is actually what democracy means is you are accountable. You in an A22 group, you are accountable to all the other A22 groups. And if you're going to be democratically accountable, you need to give them the stats, right? So giving stats isn't just it's not a capitalistic thing at all. Giving stats is actually a socialistic, democratic duty, right? To share information so you can have effective resource allocation, who gets what loans to help set up a civil resistance network. Now, I'm not saying like we're throwing babies out with the bathwater here. There's logics to both. There's the decentralized democratic logic, local autonomy, but what I'm trying to say is there's also a very strong case for a centralized democratic logic, and it's up to you guys, watching this, listening to this, is to get the balance, right? The balance, remember this word again. So you might want to check these guys out, but you can see it's quite an instructive case study, I think, for neutralizing, the pseudo-radicalness of those who basically want to go off and do their own thing and create, rotten boroughs, as they used to be called in the UK. All right, so I'm going to just go through a few speculative ideas before I finish here. And, some of these are a little bit controversial. They certainly haven't been fully developed in A22. But we're going to look at these in more detail as we look at how we're going to create the social and constitutional and political formations of this revolutionary society. So you might want to just keep a little mental note of them, because there's a bunch of, balancing contradictory logics when you're talking about these things. But I'm going to trundle through them just to provoke you a bit. So first one is deepening federal structures. So the central notion here is that the core controls the data. So this is a centralized democratic logic proposition. So the idea is if you're going to set up an A22 group, you're going to get loads of help. If you're going to get loads of help, then the centre of A22 should control your data. It's not like they control your data in the sense they're telling you what to do. No, you can do what you like. But if you all drift off and become reformists, or, you're taken over by some, charismatic pathological individual, in other words, if it all falls to bits, you don't own the data. The people who take over your A22 group, why should they control the data? Well, they can do what they like with it, potentially, because they've got access to it. But the rest of A22 should have that data so that they can email all those people and contact all those people and say, the A22 group in country X, in your country, has gone south and it's just, it's no good. So we're going to start something else. I think that's totally reasonable. And of course, you need balancing, policies that the centre of A22 isn't going to start interfering on, mundane things about when he's going to send out an email or not. Now, this is quite interesting, because if you look at examples like Porto Alegre or socialist experiments in India, in Kerala, you have this mechanism is quite strongly embedded, which is the centre can go out and reconstruct the local when it becomes corrupted. And I was involved, I can't remember whether I said this in a previous episode, but I was involved in a network called Radical Roots. It provided mortgages for housing cooperatives. It put a lot of people would put their free time into these people getting their mortgages. Great, it's cooperative house, low rent. But after 15, 20 years, the mortgage was paid off. And then the house belonged to the local housing co-op. Well, what happened was there was an intrinsic corruptibility of it, in the sense that people would go, well, we don't want to use that capital to fund anything else. We're just going to sit on it and have no rent, Well, obviously there's an injustice there, because that capital didn't belong to them. It belonged to the whole of the Radical Roots network. So arguably, there's a strong argument for saying that the houses should have actually been owned by Radical Roots and then leased to the housing cooperative. So you can see, that's one of the big issues. Another one is financial solidarity. This is fairly straightforward, potentially actually not that controversial, but this is the notion of progressive taxation. So if you're a really successful civil resistance group and, you're raising £1 million every 6 months, you pay 5% of that into the centre of A22. And that's used basically to give £10,000 to another country to get them on the go. Reasonably straightforward, right? But it requires this social solidarity ethic. So again, you're undermining that bourgeois horizontalist, we can do what we want, it's our money. This is, you only need to scrape that attitude and you can see that that's, fundamentally capitalistic, even if it pretends to be, anarchistic. It's not, it's capitalistic. Another one is creating like media personalities. This is quite fraught, just Jamie's just been telling me he doesn't like having leaders, who go on TV. Why do you have to have a leader? Well, good question. But there's the other argument is, human beings like to see a human face regularly, and that personalizes and humanizes the ideas that people put forward. If you're watching this YouTube channel, one of the reasons you're watching a video is you can see my face. I'm not necessarily the prettiest person in the world. That's not the point. The point is it's a human being. And, you shouldn't underestimate the connectivity that comes from face-to-face, eyeball-to-eyeball connection. Okay, there's lots of literature on this. So arguably, this is just a provocation, arguably, there's a bunch of personalities that talk on CNN or, on Al Jazeera. There's not just one person, there's a team. So you're sort of trying to get the best of both worlds. You haven't got one charismatic, Gandhi-esque sort of top guy, but you're also not doing this sort of dogmatic, no one can go on the media more than twice sort of situation. Okay, so the fourth one, and we're going to be talking about this lots more, is the transition of A22 into a general civil resistance, revolutionary, holistic formation. And if that intrigues you, it should do, because that's where we're going to be moving towards, and I'm going to be talking about this humanity project sort of transition, which might get called something else. The general idea here is, concretely speaking, the A22 is mainly like climate civil resistance movements, but as we all know, the social, the democratic and the ecological are increasingly the single issue. There's an ecological crisis that creates a social crisis. There's an ecological crisis because there's a democratic crisis and things can't get changed, blah, blah, blah. So what we're doing here, which is exciting and obviously challenging, is we're moving into a classical civil resistance international federal structure, for the first time since, the late 19th century, early 20th century, before state communism sort of destroyed any sort of vitality in these organizations. So that's something to think about. I'm going to be talking about it a lot more. Okay, so I think, that gives you hopefully an exciting taste of where these things can go once you've made that transition into thinking about this solid organisational paradigm. You're no longer thinking that's some dodgy thing. No, it's an exciting thing. It's a necessary thing. It's the mature thing to do when you're facing with an objective, real existential threat that we do because of ecological and social collapse. All right. So in conclusion, one of the things we can say is, everything about the A22 network has been juxtaposed to the failure of Extinction Rebellion to create a proper mode of international quality control, as you might say. It rapidly expanded. A lot of people know the story. Some of the groups are great. Some of the groups arguably still are great. And arguably a lot of the groups got hijacked, became disorganized because you didn't have this structured approach. People self-appointed themselves. Things became closed, ego-y, had this rigid horizontalist ideology captured by middle-class young people in cities, blah, blah, blah. So the A22 proposition has three key elements, this return to leadership, this return to like democratic charisma, charisma which is encased in a service orientation. This is not Trumpian. This is, Chile 1972. I've forgotten the guy who led that government, but he was in service. The best of socialistic leadership, as you might say. A structured approach to organisation, and this ideology. There's a culture. There's a way of working, which is communicated systematically. And, I've said this at the end of the last talk, but this is my final and fundamental point is this is successful. In Germany with Last Generation, it's got 90% name recognition. It's raised €1 million in 3 months last year. Just Stop Oil is 90% recognition in the UK, largest climate campaign in this country. It's just in the process of raising over £1 million. It raised £1 million last year. Over 100 people working for it, 200 or 300 people in various other sort of volunteer roles. These aren't the massive organisations of the trade union movement or socialist movements of the past, but they're a significant prototypical change from the chaotic, short-term, conflict-ridden, horizontalist sort of mess that we've had since 1989, largely across the Western world. And they're rapidly gaining credibility by the month, this methodology. So, people in XR networks are saying, yeah, this is how we want to organise. People who aren't in the climate space are saying, we want to set up a democracy civil resistance project. We're going to use this A22 methodology. So it works, okay? It works. And this has to cheer you up. You have to understand that we're 50% there in terms of saving the world because we have a vehicle that works. Now, there's no guarantees, as I keep saying. We've got to move this vehicle into actual revolutionary mode of operation, and actually put it into context where you've got a chaotic uprising situation. That hasn't been done. So it might be really easy, it might be really difficult. But the next, half of this podcast series is looking at how this could be achieved. And it's criticisable because it's going to be largely theoretical. Everything I've done up to now, I can sort of give empirical support for because it's historic. It's already happened. But we shouldn't be frightened of trusting in theory. Everything we've done over the last 4 years has been going, let's trust some of the theory. Let's look at how people have organised in the past and go, if it was good enough for them, it's good enough for us. So that's the end of that. I'm just doing a little sort of tangent thing where I'm going to release, put on the podcast series, 3 videos I did a little while ago on why the liberal, the existing system is going to collapse. So it's a little bit of a reminder of what I did in the first few episodes. So in theory, you can skip that. If you're totally convinced this system's going to collapse soon, you might not want to watch them. But if you've still got a little semblance of trust that, Greenpeace and the Labour Party in the UK or whatever, the Social Democrats in Germany, you think these guys are actually going to do the business. With all due respect, they're not. And there's really clear theoretical and empirical reasons why that's the case. So I've done a video on the legal system, video on the media system, a video on the economic system, and it gives you a whole bunch of arguments. So hopefully that's going to set you in store for the big show, which comes afterwards, which is designing the revolution proper. Thanks.